Hi. In this final lecture for the course, I would like to do what I can to find some way of presenting a survey of what we've covered until now. And the way I have thought to do that is, in fact, to offer another way of looking at ethics. And in some ways, it's another theory of ethics. But I think this theory has the benefit of, again, serving as a sort of, serving to offer a comprehensive retrospect on what we've covered until now. And so, by thinking about ethics in this way, I believe it will also help us to recollect and to comprehensively grasp what we've covered until now. This theory that I would like to set forth in this final lecture consists in comparing ethics or comparing moral action to speech. In other words, setting up speech as an analog for ethics. Let me try to explain what I mean by that, because it might sound simplistic or uninteresting in some way. And I think part of that has to do with just the fact that something like speech, it seems so banal and so common that what could it possibly have to offer in terms of some kind of new insight or new understanding. But I think precisely because speech is something so common, we might be tempted to, we might be inclined not to notice the real, what's really at stake when we speak, when we're able to communicate. And so I will just say a few words about that and try to offer some ways of uncovering aspects of speech that we might not ordinarily consider. And this then is in the service of trying to set up an analogy that will give us some kind of new perspective or new insight into the study of ethics, the subject of ethics. Again, just to recall an image that we set before ourselves at the very beginning of this course, we can think of this final theory as something like attempting to, it's another perspective of the elephant, so to speak, just invoking the parable of the blind man and the elephant. We've circumambulated the elephant, as it were, and approached it from different sides now. In some way, this theory that I'm going to try to articulate today, it's one perspective among other perspectives. But at the same time, we've been present and we've accompanied. Everyone watching this video has been in a company in this kind of circumambulation of the elephant. And so, what I mean to say is that we're bringing all of these perspectives with us at the same time. We're carrying them with us. And so, in some way, we can also see. Well, it's not as though we learn things or we gain knowledge merely by accumulation. It's not as though we just pile one fact onto another fact. Instead, our knowledge is much more akin to an organism that has a sort of inner logic. What I mean by that is everything we learn, every new thing we learn, changes what we already know in some way, because everything has to fit together in a sort of comprehensive and logical, with internal coherence. And so the implication of thinking of knowledge that way is that we are making use of everything that we've learned until now. And so when we encounter a new theory of ethics, we are also, it's not merely one side of the elephant anymore. It's rather, we're coming close to really perceiving the elephant as such, and not just one feature or one aspect of it. And so, with this theory of thinking about, we first have to kind of set forth before ourselves what we mean by speech. And again, speech is something so ordinary that we might not consider that we might not imagine that there's much to think about with speech. But I do just want to try to give a picture of speech that might be something that we don't usually think of. And this will demand that we, in some ways, think of two components of speech, or two elements of speech. By analogy, when we think about water, we can think that the water is both cool and wet. Or we can think of fire, and we can think of the fire is both hot and bright, or hot and dry. Similarly, speech has speech or language or a word. It has two aspects, and I will call these aspects the inner aspect and the outer aspect. I'll try to explain what I mean by each one, starting with the outer aspect. The outer aspect is in some way anything we could measure in a laboratory or with our senses, for example. And so we might think of the outer aspect as in some way, well, by itself, the outer aspect is not itself speech, because the outer aspect, it's really just noise. And so if we measure it with a microphone, we will be measuring decibels or vibrations. When we listen, for example, right now, I'm speaking into a recording device, but really what the recording device is taking in or measuring, that by itself is not actually speech, because it's only measuring the outer aspect. And so again, what I mean by the outer aspect is something like, again, what can be measured, what can be recorded. In some way, the outer aspect is something like a vehicle, or something that carries, like a ferry. It's something that carries the inner aspect. And so now I'll try to explain what I mean by the inner aspect. And then I'll try to show how one of them by itself, one of them alone, is not speech, is not language. And language consists precisely in this kind of union, which forms a bridge. It joins, it connects the outer aspect and the inner aspect. By the inner aspect, I mean, in some way, well, what the noise is intended to convey, as it were. In other words, when I speak, I am making noise, but I'm doing more than just making noise. Or put another way, my noise is meant to express something. The sounds that I make, they're not just sounds. They are speech, or they're intended to be understood. They're intended to be intelligible. And so the sequence of sounds that I make, or noise, or phonemes, it's not arbitrary. It has a very precise and logical order, and that order is intended just precisely to be able to bear, or to be able to convey the meaning that I'm intending to express with my speech. And again, this is every instance of communication. It consists, again, in some kind of both an inner and an outer aspect. Again, the outer aspect is something like a vehicle, and the inner aspect is what is carried by that vehicle, the meaning, right? And so when I listen, I'm receiving this meaning that I'm receiving this meaning that was born to me, or carried to me, ferried to me, by way of whether it's verbal speech or writing is very much the same way. So with an alphabet, or any kind of writing, hieroglyphics too. What I just mean by that is the symbol in that case, the outer sign. The outer sign again is the outer aspect, and whatever that outer sign means, when I read something, I'm with my eyes again. So what my senses can perceive, that by itself is not language. It's not writing. It's not words. It's only shapes on a paper or a computer screen, for example. It's only shapes. But then when I'm able to complement it with what it means, then suddenly it becomes writing. And so similarly, if I'm illiterate, if I don't know how to read, I won't be able to, it won't be intelligible to me, merely the outer aspect. And so in that way, it won't be language at all. It will just be something visual that I perceive. And so again, taking this idea of language as somehow straddling an inner dimension, a dimension of meaning, a dimension of understanding, a dimension of intelligibility. It straddles an inner dimension with an outer dimension. And by that I mean physical dimension, something that is measurable by physical instruments or our senses, our physical senses. Our physical senses perceive the outer aspect. Our minds or our understanding perceives the inner aspect, and then these two together we recognize as speech or as language. Now, we can think of ethics as something quite analogous to this, and I began in the first lecture of this series. I began with contrasting ethics to other subjects that we might study, and one basic distinction between ethics and many other academic subjects is that in studying most academic subjects, like engineering or chemistry, we have an object that we're trying to learn about. We're trying to gain data and information and knowledge about this object. This object is something it's something opposed to us. It's something that we confront objectively. I contrasted this to ethics because in ethics we don't have the same kind of scenario that we do with many other subjects. And the reason for that is because with ethics, in some way, we become our own objects. Put another way, the subject of ethics doesn't exist before we are there to act. So we are basically creating the objects that are the objects of our study. And we do this through our deeds. And so our own actions are also the objects of this study. And so there's something reflexive about ethics. And by that I mean it's in some way the study is turned upon itself. We're not just encountering facts. We're trying to understand not facts but actions, and these actions are actions that we ourselves initiate. It's very similar with speech. When we think about speech, we're always participating in the speech, and whether we're the ones verbalizing or if we are understanding speech, in any case we're participating with it. What I mean is something doesn't become speech for us until we've understood it, and in that way our understanding has already in some way joined with or participated with the speaker. And so whether we find ourselves in the position of expression or impression, speaking or listening, by the time we recognize it as speech, we've already begun to participate it with our minds and with our understanding. Again, if we didn't do that, we wouldn't recognize it as speech. We would just hear noise, or we would see symbols. We wouldn't recognize it as speech or as writing, respectively. Now, if then we think again about ethics, it's very similar, because when we study ethics, we're not studying behavior by itself. Because if we were, this would be akin to studying speech, attempting to study speech by way of sound waves, frequencies, decibels, right? This is not to say that these things are not true or they're not potential objects of study. It's just that you're studying something different than speech if you study the vehicle or the means by which meaning is conveyed. Similarly, if we're not really studying writing, well, for example, if we're reading a book and we're inquiring into for example, the typeface. I happen to love Garamond. I'm a Garamond fiend for this font. But in any case, the minute that I start to think about the font, or if I start to think about the shape of the letters, for example, Latin letters, they have their own kind of elegance, but it's not the same kind of elegance that Greek letters have, for example, or Arabic letters. Arabic letters, they have a certain artistic element That's also present in other alphabets, but Arabic alphabet has a really unique artistic element. In any case, what I started talking about is something different than language. It's something different than what the writing is there for, really. The writing, the letters and the alphabet and the symbols that convey the meaning of a text, they themselves are means and not ends. The end of the text is what the text means. The means by which it's conveyed is the letters, for example. Now, if I start to study the typeface, or if I start to reflect and admire the shape and the angles and the angles of the different legs and tongues and tails of a given letter, again, I've started to study something that's not the same thing as writing. Now, similarly, if we're studying behavior, or if we're studying sociology, for example, or social trends, social studies, again, this is a perfectly legitimate object for study, but it's not the same thing as ethics. For a similar reason that studying typeface is not the same thing as studying words or studying writing. The reason is because it's failing to account for or recognize what I have called at the beginning of this lecture the inner dimension. And by that I just mean the meaning or the semantic content that those letters or that sequence of sounds is meant to convey. If we're only studying behavior, if we're only studying sociology or economics, we're only studying one aspect or one element of what can only become speech or what can only become ethics if it's coupled together with an inner aspect. This inner aspect, if we think about ethics, what is missing in a mere study of behavior is the meaning or the intention or the motive of which the outer behavior is an expression. And so similarly, when I prepare to say something, I experience a meaning that I wish to in some way transpose or transliterate into sounds and phonemes and syllables. Similarly, when I consider ethical action, I'm whatever my deed, my act, it's in some way it's an expression of my intention or my motive. The action by itself, the action doesn't just come out of nowhere. The action itself is an expression of some motive or some value that I have as the inner dimension to that act. Again, when we think about a deed or an action, we're talking about something different than just, for example, a landslide or a tree falling in the forest, right? Or the revolution of planets. Because when we talk about a deed or an action, we understand that the deed or the action doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's rather there's always a subject, there's always an agent, an actor that does that act or that does that deed. And again, it's from that agent that outer expression kind of flows or emerges. And again, I think speech is another analogy. When we think about speech, it always implies a speaker. There's no such thing as just kind of immaterial speech that's just kind of shows up out of nowhere and just suspended in the ether somewhere. If we do encounter some kind of speech like that, it's always in some way its origin. It always began with a speaker. So speech always issues from a speaker. In the same way that action always issues from an agent. And so again, when we think about ethics, it's quite different from other subjects, because in other subjects we can In some way, we can pretend that we don't exist. When we're studying something, we can imagine, we can study it at a sort of arm's length. And again, we pretend that the subject is something totally separate from us. And we are kind of external observers, external onlookers. We have a sort of view from nowhere, that we're just looking onto a situation without being part of it. We can never study ethics like that, because we're always studying something that, we're always essentially and inextricably related to our actions, again, as the agents of these actions. And so we can never study ethics as a subject, as an abstract subject, as a subject that we can just merely approach as sort of outsiders or onlookers to it. Instead, with ethics, to quote Plato, when we study ethics, it's not just some. He says, we're not studying any small matter. We're studying how to live. And so when we're studying ethics, in some way, we're studying our own lives. And so now that I've set up this parallel or this analogy between speech and ethics, I think it might be helpful to consider what kind of light it might cast on some of the other theories that we've studied. When we kind of recapitulate and go back over the course, we've encountered theories. Some of the most prominent ones were Utilitarian Ethics, which thinks about, which conceptualizes ethics as a question of whether the outcome, so whether purely the effect or the outcome or the consequence of a given action, whether that outcome serves to foster net happiness or net pleasure. And so then we would think about our deeds as somehow these deeds express in some way these deeds are expressions of a concern for increasing net pleasure. As a sort of side note, it's very difficult to apply this theory of ethics to utilitarianism, merely because utilitarianism, in some way, it's arguably studying something different than ethics, for the same reason that, for example, studying behavior or studying sociology is studying something different than is ordinarily thought of with ethics. What I mean by that is utilitarianism, it's measuring the value, the ethical and moral value of an action by the outcome of that same action. The trouble with this is that at the time that the action was perpetrated, so the origin of the action, the time that the action originated, the outcome of that action didn't exist yet. And so, in other words, you're trying to get to the act by way of the fact. It's similar to, by analogy, you might say it's like trying to get to the grape by way of the wine. The wine is the product of a grape. Similarly, the outcome, the consequence, the fact, is the product of the act. And so the utilitarian concept of ethics, despite its utility, despite that it's useful in some ways of some questions and some ways of thinking, and you have to kind of measure, broad scale, abstract questions, for the greater good, it can be useful. At the same time, it's not so helpful in our own lives, which again is the most immediate subject of ethics. When we think about another prominent theory that we've studied, I'm thinking of Kantian ethics. In the same way, we would ask the question of whether in our deeds and our actions, whether we are in fact acting in a way that is consistent with, which is to say that our actions are expressions of our will to align ourselves and to conform with what Kant calls the categorical imperative. And so in some way, whether our actions express the fact that we're not making exceptions for ourselves, that we're not making exceptions with something that we would at the same time as we are personally doing it, that we could at the same time will and wish that it should become a universal maxim, that everyone should will to do this at the same time. And if we can't at the same time wield this, then in some way we're acting unethically, because we are making a logical contradiction by accepting ourselves from something that should apply to all human beings. When we think about Aristotelian ethics, this is much more congenial to this theory that I've set forth in this video, because with Aristotelian ethics, it's very clear that the measure of ethics in some way is it's a question of whether we live, whether our lives and our deeds are expressions of given virtues. Right? And so again, this is very analogous to the idea of whether our speech is an expression of meaning. Right? When our speech is not an expression of meaning, then in some way we're just it's hardly speech. It's more like, well, if we speak but we don't mean anything really, we're either just making noise, or we're somehow engaged in something that's only halfway speech. It could be called like banter or idle chatter. This is not to say that there's no place in our lives for banter or idle chatter. It's just that these are not exactly they have very little moral value. Well, they have no semantic value, and so similarly, to continue this analogy, I misspoke. When we're engaged in something like idle chatter, what we're saying, again, it doesn't really mean anything. We're not speaking to express meaning. We're just speaking to speak. In this case, our chatter has very little semantic value. By analogy, if we are acting for no reason, if we're just kind of engaged in busyness, or if we're engaged in movement, or we're engaged in motion rather than action, by analogy, we are engaged in something that has very little moral value. We're just moving for the sake of motion, and we're not acting for the sake of expressing some value or some virtue. Right? And so with Aristotelian ethics, it's a question of whether a person's actions instantiate or express given virtues. Similarly, with this way of thinking about ethics, we can ask the question of whether our actions speak in some way. And I've set these two. I've set up ethics and speech as analogs or parallels. But in some way, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that they're not entirely separate things, and in fact, they might be almost the same thing, because our actions. There's a famous idiom that says actions speak louder than words. Even Shakespeare has an amazing, as one might expect from Shakespeare, extremely concise and elegant way of saying the same thing in one of his plays, Coriolanus. Coriolanus's mother says action is eloquence. And so it's expressing a similar idea. It's that our actions, we also speak with our actions. Our actions express something, and what they express is just the intention or the meaning or the motive that basically impelled the action. Like, why did we act in the first place? Our actions in some way are expressions or vehicles that convey the why of our action, the why. And so we could think of, if you imagine the way that our vocal organs and our tongues and speech organs and larynx, they shape the air, the acoustics, they form the air in a certain way. And this basically figures and configures the acoustical configurations. Creates the sound that bears our meaning between people in communication. Similarly, we can think of our limbs in moral action. our limbs are some way speaking in a very similar way. They're expressing something. And what they're expressing is just our reason for acting, or our why for acting. The last one, then, of course, we covered Rudolf Steiner's ethics. And Rudolf Steiner's view of ethics, in some way it's very clear how thinking of ethics as speech, and thinking of ethics as thinking of ethics by analogy with speech, and also in some ways by identity with speech. Rudolf Steiner, maybe in the clearest and most concise way, he shows how ethical action, it's action that originates from a place that we are conscious of our freedom, and so the moral value of an action is measured by our degree of consciousness of the reason for that action, or the motive for that action. And precisely the same thing can be said about speech. Speech, the kind of semantic intensity of speech, it has to do with exactly the same question. To what degree we're able to what degree we mean what we say. And to the degree that we mean what we say, this is to that degree, what we say has semantic content. It means something, and so we can imagine a sort of spectrum between noise on one end, noise becoming. So noise could be anything. It could be again like a volcano or something, or traffic. Noise, this can become the song of birds, for example, right? Or it can become idle chatter, where we kind of mean something but not really, and we're mostly just speaking just to speak. And then on the other end of the spectrum is speech that that basically issues from the origin of meaning something and wishing to communicate and to express that meaning to another person. Yeah. And so the speech that originates in the relationship, the relationship of communication between a speaker and a listener, in just the same way, when we think about ethics, we imply relation between people. We don't think about ethics in outer space or ethics on a desert island exactly. We think about ethics as a kind of, again, it arises in an agent and a patient, so to speak. And so Rudolf Steiner's view of ethics, again, it's a kind of, it awakens us to this question of to what degree, it gives us a way of thinking about ethics not as a sort of binary, dichotomy between ethical and unethical, but rather we can think of degrees or gradients of ethics. And for Rudolf Steiner, this is the same thing as this map or this gradient. It's the same gradient of freedom. So to what degree we are free, and once again, it's the same gradient as to what degree we are conscious of our reasons for acting or our reasons for speaking. And so just to kind of, to conclude this lecture, and also to sort of again try to draw everything together as a sort of conclusion to this course, and also the thoughts that I've kind of arrayed before us in this lecture. To continue with the idea of thinking about ethics as not a question of not a dichotomy, or not a question of ethical versus unethical, but rather a spectrum or a gradient of ethics, of morality, which is the same thing as a gradient of freedom, which is the same thing as a gradient of consciousness of one's reason for acting. It might seem that, again, this might seem like something of one might be a little bit skeptical. It might seem like a questionable basis for morality, because usually when we think of morality or ethics, we think of following some kind of rules, following some kind of external commandments, for example, or some kind of code, a code of ethics that we have to in some way follow. Like it's an external code, it's a code external to ourselves, and we're sort of forced to conform our actions to that code externally. And I think this theory that I've set forth in this video, and also Rudolf Steiner's theory of ethics, they give us a way of thinking about it differently. And again, it has to do with a kind of internal awakening, and it's something so simple, but also so difficult as trying to bring attention to our actions, and specifically trying to bring attention to our motives and our reasons for acting. And this is the kind of fundament for ethics. So in the same way that when we mean something and then express that meaning in speech, this lends speech semantic content, and it gives it semantic value compared to speech that we just speak without meaning. In a similar way, when we have a motive for acting, our action becomes something expressive and it becomes something ethical. We might think, though, that merely paying attention to our motives for acting, or merely paying attention to the meanings that we're attempting to express and to share with other people, we might think that that merely paying attention would have no effect, because again, it's not nothing that Rudolf Schneider says, and certainly nothing that I've said in this lecture. I haven't offered, and Rudolf Schneider doesn't offer any kind of prescription or any kind of code or any kind of rules, any kind of commandments for here's what you ought to do, or here's what thou shalt not do. It's nothing like that. The only injunction is just to pay attention to what we're already doing, in some way to illuminate our own the actions and the ways that we're already living. It's merely to illuminate those to ourselves. We might think that would have no significance, and it would have no consequence. Like we might think that merely by bringing attention to something, that it wouldn't have any effect. And it might seem this way, but in my experience, it's not this way at all. And I don't, and never have, encouraged anyone merely to just believe what I say, just to take it on faith, but rather everything I say is a kind of invitation to explore and question whether it's true. But I offer this, and I believe that anyone can confirm this in his or her own experience, that paying attention to something also changes that thing. And we can understand why that would be the case, because if you imagine a scenario or a situation, the situation would include just everything about a given situation. If we add attention to that scenario, it will change the description of the scenario. In other words, it changes the situation, because you're adding an element that before wasn't present. And so, in fact, it's not the same situation at all, and you have changed something without in some way fiddling with it too much. You've changed it with a kind of a delicate or an elegant touch. That's probably, with that kind of invitation to experiment. And again, it's a kind of invitation to for all of us to take our own lives as kind of workshops or laboratories, so to speak. With that invitation, I think it's probably a good place to draw this lecture to a close, and to draw this series of lectures to a close. And so I'll do that, but as always, not before sending my wishing the very best to everyone who watches this video, wherever and whenever this might find you. And from Anchorage, Alaska, in July 2020, my best wishes to everyone, and farewell until next time.